Dr. Sarah Chun had always believed in the goodness of the Galactic Federation. Even as the energy shackles bit into her wrists, even as the cold metal corridor stretched endlessly before her, she held onto that faith. The two enforcer guards flanking her moved with mechanical precision, their crystalline armor reflecting the harsh blue light of the detention level. "There's been a mistake," Sarah said for the 100th time since her arrest. Her voice echoed off the sterile walls of the prison ship Judgment's Edge. "I'm a medic. I was treating wounded civilians on Kepler 7. The guard to her left, designation KX-9, turned his featureless helmet toward her. Medical personnel who aid rebel forces are classified as enemy combatants under Article 47 of the Galactic Security Act. Sarah's heart sank. The wounded she had treated weren't rebels. They were farmers caught in the crossfire when Federation forces clashed with local militias over mining rights. She had taken an oath to help anyone in need, regardless of politics. That oath had apparently sealed her fate. The corridor opened into a vast holding area. Dozens of cells lined the walls, each one a transparent energy barrier containing various alien species. Some paced frantically, others sat in dejected silence. The air hummed with the low frequency of containment fields and the distant rumble of the ship's engines. "Cell 847, announced the second guard, consulting a holographic display. "Special containment protocols active." They stopped before what appeared to be an empty cell. Sarah frowned, peering through the shimmering barrier. The space was larger than the others, perhaps 30 feet square, with rough stone walls instead of metal. Artificial sunlight streamed from hidden panels, and she could see what looked like natural vegetation growing in one corner. "This doesn't look like a standard holding cell," she observed. KX-9 input a command sequence into the control panel. "Prisoner 847 Alpha requires specialized accommodation due to biological necessities." The energy barrier flickered and dissolved. Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the guard shoved her forward. She stumbled into the cell, spinning around just as the barrier reformed behind her. "Wait," she called out, pressing her hands against the energy field. "What biological necessities? Who else is in here?" But the guards were already walking away, their footsteps fading into the mechanical symphony of the ship. Sarah was alone, or so she thought. A low rumble emanated from the darker recesses of the cell. Sarah froze, her medical training kicking in as her heart rate spiked. That sound was too deep, too resonant to come from any humanoid species she knew. Slowly, she turned toward the source. In the shadows cast by an artificial rocky outcropping, something massive stirred. Sarah caught a glimpse of scales that shimmered like oil on water, each one the size of her palm. A serpentine neck emerged from the darkness, followed by a head that belonged in ancient Earth legends. The dragon was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Its eyes burned with an inner fire, ancient and intelligent. When it spoke, its voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Another sacrifice from the metal men," the dragon said, its words heavily accented by an alien tongue. "They seem to think I require regular feeding." Sarah's legs nearly gave out. You can speak." "Of course I can speak," the dragon replied with what might have been amusement. "I am Korith Flames of Wisdom, last of the Draconic Circle of Altair Prime. The question is, little human, can you understand?" Sarah forced herself to remain standing, though every instinct screamed at her to run. There was nowhere to go anyway. "I'm Dr. Sarachen. I'm a medic, not a sacrifice. There's been a mistake." Korith's massive head tilted, studying her with those burning eyes. "A healer? Interesting. The enforcers usually send criminals and rebels. What crime did you commit to earn such a fate?" "I helped wounded civilians," Sarah said, surprised to hear anger creeping into her voice. "Apparently, that makes me a terrorist sympathizer." The dragon's expression shifted, and Sarah could have sworn she saw something like sympathy in those ancient features. "Ah, you chose compassion over politics. A dangerous path in these times." Sarah sank down onto a smooth stone that seemed placed for sitting. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. How long have you been imprisoned here? Time moves differently for my kind, Korath replied, settling his massive bulk more comfortably. By human reckoning, perhaps 20 cycles of your world around its star. I was captured during the pacification of Altair Prime. 20 years, Sarah whispered. What did you do? Korath's eyes flashed dangerously. I refused to reveal the location of my people's Exodus fleet. The enforcers believe that suffering will eventually loosen my tongue. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cell's temperature. And the people they've been feeding you? I do not consume sentient beings, Korath said firmly, though the enforcers seem convinced that all dragons are mindless beasts. I have watched dozens of beings die in this cell over the years, from fear, from despair, from the simple shock of finding themselves face to face with their worst nightmare. The weight of her situation crashed down on Sarah like a collapsing building. She was trapped in a cell with a 20-foot-long dragon, on a ship somewhere in deep space, condemned by people who saw her mercy as treason. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, despite her efforts to remain composed. I just wanted to help people, she whispered. Korath observed her for a long moment. Then, with surprising gentleness, he lowered his great head until it was level with her. Perhaps you still can, Dr. Sarah-chan. Sarah looked up through her tears. What do you mean? I have been alone for 20 years, the dragon said softly. In all that time, you are the first being to speak to me as an equal rather than a monster. Perhaps the enforcers have finally made a mistake that will cost them dearly. Despite everything, Sarah found herself curious. How so? Korath's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. They have given a healer to one who has been wounded for far too long. And they have given a dragon to someone who still believes in helping others. Sarah wiped her eyes, feeling a spark of something she hadn't expected. Hope. Are you wounded? I mean physically? Not in the way you might understand, Korath replied. But perhaps we can help each other survive what comes next. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, an announcement echoed through the ship's communication system. The voice was cold and mechanical, stripped of all human emotion. Attention prisoners. We are approaching detention station Omega 7. Final destinations will be assigned upon arrival. Prepare for transfer protocols. Korath's head snapped up, his entire body tensing. Omega 7, he growled. The breaker? What's Omega 7? Sarah asked, though the dread in the dragon's voice told her she probably didn't want to know. A place where the Federation sends beings they wish to break completely, Korath explained, his voice grim. Few who enter ever leave. And those who do are no longer themselves. Sarah felt the ship beginning to decelerate, the engine's pitch changing as they dropped out of hyperspace. Through the artificial stone walls, she could feel the vibrations of docking clamps engaging with something much larger than their prison transport. What do we do? She asked. Korath turned his burning gaze on her, and Sarah saw something new there, determination mixed with desperate hope. We do what the enforcers least expect, he said. We trust each other. The lights in their cell began to pulse red, indicating an imminent transfer. Sarah stood up, her legs shaking, but her resolve hardening. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And somehow, she sensed that Korath felt the same way. As the energy barrier around their cell began to flicker and change, preparing for transport, Sarah reached out and placed her small human hand on the dragon's massive snout. The scales were warm beneath her palm, and she felt the steady rhythm of his breathing. I don't know what's going to happen to us, she said quietly, but I promise you this. If there's any way to help each other through whatever comes next, I'll find it. Korath's eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. For the first time in 20 years, the last dragon of Altair Prime had found hope. The cell barrier dissolved completely, and enforcer guards in heavy combat armor flooded in. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, but she could feel Korath's presence beside her, solid and reassuring even in the face of the unknown. Whatever Omega 7 held for them, they would face it together. Detention Station Omega 7 was a monument to despair carved from a dead asteroid. As Sarah was marched through its corridors alongside Korath, she couldn't help but notice how the architecture itself seemed designed to crush the spirit. The ceilings pressed down oppressively low in some sections, then soared to impossible heights in others, creating a sense of constant disorientation. The enforcers had fitted Korath with neural dampeners, cruel devices that wrapped around his skull like a crown of thorns, sending periodic jolts of pain through his nervous system. Despite this, the dragon maintained his dignity, moving with fluid grace even as the dampeners made him wince. Prisoner 847 Alpha will be housed in Containment Sector 7, announced the lead enforcer, a tall figure whose armor bore the insignia of a detention commander. Prisoner 924 Beta will be processed for Rehabilitation Protocol Omega. Sarah's blood ran cold. She had heard whispers of the Omega Protocol during her medical training, a rumored process that stripped away everything that made a being unique, leaving behind a compliant shell. "Wait," she called out. "I demand to know what Rehabilitation Protocol Omega involves." The commander's helmet turned toward her with mechanical precision. "Prisoners have no rights to information regarding their processing. You will proceed to Intake Station 7 immediately." Two guards moved to separate Sarah from Korath, but the dragon suddenly stopped moving. All of his massive weight settled, becoming an immovable obstacle in the corridor. The neural dampeners sent violent shocks through his system, but he endured them without making a sound. "Korath," Sarah whispered. "The metal men fear what they cannot understand," the dragon said quietly, his voice strained but determined. 20 years ago, I made a choice that cost my people their world. Today, I make a different choice." Before anyone could react, Korath's tail swept sideways with incredible speed. Despite the dampeners limiting his coordination, he managed to knock two guards off their feet. Alarms began blaring throughout the station. "Contain the creature," the commander barked. "Activate maximum neural suppression." The dampeners around Korath's head blazed with energy, sending convulsions through his entire body. He collapsed to the metal floor, his breathing labored, but his eyes remained fixed on Sarah. "Remember your oath, healer," he gasped between shock waves. "There are others here who need your help." More guards arrived, weapons trained on the fallen dragon. Sarah found herself pushed against the wall as the enforcers prepared to drag Korath away. In that moment, watching them brutalize a being who had shown her nothing but kindness, something fundamental shifted inside her. "Stop!" she shouted, breaking free from the guards restraining her. "He's injured. As a licensed medical practitioner, I demand the right to treat him." The commander paused. "You have no authority here. The Galactic Medical Charter supersedes local detention protocols," Sarah said, drawing on half-remembered legal training from medical school. Article 12 clearly states that licensed medical personnel have the right and obligation to provide emergency care to any being in immediate danger. It was mostly bluff. She wasn't even sure if the charter applied to military detention facilities. But she spoke with enough conviction that the commander hesitated. That hesitation was all Sarah needed. She dropped to her knees beside Korath, pulling a basic medical scanner from her confiscated supplies that the guards hadn't bothered to examine closely. The device hummed to life, and Sarah began running scans of the dragon's vital signs. "Severe neural trauma," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Synaptic cascade failure imminent. If these dampeners aren't calibrated properly, you'll have a dead prisoner instead of a useful interrogation subject." The commander stepped closer. "Explain." Sarah was making most of it up as she went along, but her years of medical training gave weight to her words. Draconic nervous systems are fundamentally different from mammalian ones. The neural dampeners are designed for humanoid physiology. They're literally cooking his brain from the inside. She looked up at the commander's featureless helmet. "How useful is a dead dragon to your interrogation protocols?" For several tense seconds, the only sound was the blaring of alarms and Korath's labored breathing. Finally, the commander gestured to one of the technicians. "Reduce neural suppression to minimum operational levels." The blazing energy around Korth's skull dimmed, and his breathing immediately became more regular. Sarah continued her fake examination, using the time to whisper to the dragon. "Can you move?" she asked under her breath. "Some," Korth whispered back, "but not enough to fight our way out." "Then, we'll have to be smart about this." Sarah stood up, addressing the commander again. "The prisoner requires ongoing medical monitoring. The neural trauma could lead to permanent brain damage, making him useless for interrogation. What do you propose?" "Assign me as his medical supervisor," Sarah said. "I can ensure he remains healthy enough for your purposes while preventing any expensive accidents." The commander was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing the options. Finally, he nodded. "Temporary medical assignment approved. You will be housed in a monitoring cell adjacent to the prisoner. Any attempt to aid an escape will result in immediate termination." As they were led deeper into the station, Sarah caught glimpses of other prisoners through the transparent walls of their cells. What she saw made her stomach turn. Beings of various species sat motionless, their eyes empty of any spark of consciousness. The Omega Protocol was real, and it was terrifyingly effective. Korth's new containment area was larger than their previous cell, but far more sinister. The walls were lined with neural projection arrays, devices designed to beam thoughts and images directly into a prisoner's mind. Sarah's adjacent cell was separated by a force field that allowed communication but prevented physical contact. Once the guards had left them alone, Sarah immediately began examining the technology around them. Her medical training had included some engineering courses, and she recognized several of the components. "They're planning to break you," she told Korth quietly. "These neural projectors can implant false memories, alter personality structures, even induce complete psychological breakdown." Korth had curled up in the center of his cell, conserving energy despite the dampeners. "I assumed as much. 20 years of imprisonment was merely the prelude." "There has to be a way to disrupt the system," Sarah muttered, studying the control panels visible through the walls. "If I could access the maintenance conduits." "Dr. Chun," Korth interrupted gently. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah paused in her examination of the neural arrays. "What do you mean? You could have claimed medical necessity and negotiated for better conditions for yourself," the dragon explained. "Instead, you chose to tie your fate to mine." "Why?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the question. "When I became a doctor, I took an oath to do no harm, to preserve life, to treat all patients with dignity regardless of their circumstances. The Federation calls you a terrorist, but all I see is a being who's been tortured for 20 years for refusing to betray his people." She turned to look at him directly. "Besides, I think we both know that once they're done with you, they'll move on to me. Our best chance is to work together." Korth's expression was unreadable. "You realize that even if we escape this cell, this station, this entire sector of space, we will be hunted for the rest of our lives." "Maybe," Sarah admitted, "but at least we'll be alive to be hunted." Before Korth could respond, the neural projection arrays around his cell began to glow. Sarah watched in horror as the dragon's body went rigid, his eyes rolling back as foreign thoughts were forced into his mind. She could see flashes of what they were showing him reflected in the polished surfaces around the cell. Images of human cities burning, Federation ships being destroyed, civilians screaming in terror. They were trying to make him believe that his refusal to cooperate had led to massive loss of life. "It's not real," Sarah shouted, pressing against the force field separating them. "Korth, those are fabricated images. Don't let them in." But the dragon was lost in the artificial nightmare, his massive body convulsing as the neural projectors pumped false memories into his consciousness. Sarah knew that if she didn't act fast, the being who had shown her kindness and hope would be broken beyond repair. Frantically, she began examining the force field generator that separated their cells. If she could overload it somehow, create a feedback loop through the station's power grid. Her hands flew over her medical scanner, reprogramming it to emit electromagnetic pulses on specific frequencies. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but it was all she had. The scanner began to whine as she pushed it beyond its design limits. Sparks flew from the force field generator, and the lights in their cell section flickered ominously. "Come on," Sarah whispered, sweat beading on her forehead as she fought to maintain the overload. "Just give me one chance." Suddenly, the force field collapsed with a shower of sparks. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dove through the opening into Korth's cell, her hands already reaching for the neural dampeners around his skull. Alarms began blaring throughout the section as guards rushed to respond to the containment breach. Sarah knew she had seconds before they arrived, seconds to free her only ally before they were both lost forever. The neural dampeners were locked in place with quantum encryption, impossible to remove without the proper codes. But Sarah was a doctor, and she understood anatomy better than any enforcer engineer. Instead of trying to remove the devices, she jammed her medical scanner directly against the connection points where they interfaced with Korth's nervous system. The scanner's overloaded circuits discharged directly into the dampener's control systems, creating a cascade failure that shut down the entire neural suppression array. Korth's eyes snapped open, blazing with fury and something else, freedom. For the first time in 20 years, his mind was completely his own. The dragon rose to his full height just as the first guards burst into the cell block. When he spoke, his voice carried the power of ancient fury finally, unleashed. "You have made a grave error, metal men," Korth rumbled, flames beginning to flicker around his jaws. "You should never have given a healer to a dragon who remembers how to burn." The guards raised their weapons, but Korth was no longer the broken prisoner they had tormented for decades. He was Korth Flames of Wisdom, last of the Draconic Circle, and he had found something worth fighting for again. The first blast of dragon fire turned the corridor into an inferno. Guards scattered as Korth unleashed 20 years of suppressed fury, his flames melting through their energy shields like paper. But Sarah could see that despite his newfound freedom, the dragon was still weakened from decades of imprisonment. "This way," she shouted, grabbing emergency medical supplies from a nearby storage unit. The ventilation systems lead to the central processing area. Korth followed her lead, his massive form somehow managing to navigate the station's corridors with surprising grace. Behind them, more alarms joined the cacophony as enforcement squads mobilized throughout Omega 7. The other prisoners, Korth growled as they passed cell after cell of broken beings. "We cannot leave them." Sarah's heart ached as she looked at the empty-eyed faces staring back at them. The Omega Protocol. Is there any way to reverse it? Unknown, Korth admitted, pausing before one cell containing a young Altarian whose species he recognized. But perhaps we can prevent more from suffering the same fate. Sarah quickly accessed a maintenance terminal, her fingers flying over the controls as she used her medical scanner to hack into the station systems. "If I can overload the neural processing center, it might disrupt the protocol stations wide." "Do it," Korth said firmly. "Even if we die here, we can save others from this torment." As Sarah worked, Korth stood guard, his enhanced senses picking up the approaching enforcement teams. He could hear the heavy footsteps of battle mechs being deployed, the whine of charging energy weapons, the mechanical voices coordinating their attack. "Almost got it," Sarah muttered, sweat dripping onto the control panel. "Just need to bypass the safety protocols." The lights went out. Emergency illumination cast eerie red shadows as Sarah's hack succeeded, sending cascading power failures throughout the station's neural processing networks. In cells throughout Omega 7, the constant bombardment of mind-altering signals finally stopped. Some prisoners looked around in confusion, the first sparks of awareness returning to their eyes. Others remained lost, the damage to their minds too extensive to heal quickly. But for many, Sarah's desperate gambit had given them the first moment of mental clarity they'd experienced in months or years. It worked, she breathed, hardly believing it herself. "Celebrate later," Korth warned, his head swiveling toward the sound of approaching mechs. We need to reach the hangar bay. There may be ships we can commandeer. They ran through corridors filled with smoke and confusion as the station's automated systems struggled to cope with the massive power disruptions. Emergency blast doors sealed randomly, forcing them to find alternate routes through maintenance shafts and service tunnels. In one of these tunnels, they encountered other escapees, prisoners who had taken advantage of the chaos to break free from their cells. A group of Centaurian miners recognized Korath and dropped to their knees in reverence. "Flames of wisdom," their leader whispered. "The legend spoke of your capture, but we thought you dead." "Not dead," Korath replied grimly. "Merely sleeping. But I am awake now." Sarah watched the exchange with growing understanding. Korath wasn't just another prisoner. He was a symbol of resistance throughout this sector of space. His escape would inspire rebellions on a dozen worlds. "Can you guide us to the hangar?" Sarah asked the Centaurians. "The main hangar is heavily guarded," the leader replied. "But there are maintenance bays on level 7. Small ships for station personnel." As they made their way toward level 7, they passed through the station's central hub. Through massive viewports, Sarah could see the reality of Omega 7 for the first time. The detention station was enormous, a twisted fusion of asteroid and artificial construction that housed thousands of prisoners. But more shocking was what lay beyond it. A massive Federation fleet hung in space nearby. Not just a few ships, but hundreds of vessels, including several city-sized dreadnoughts. "They're not just processing prisoners here," Sarah realized with growing horror. "This is a staging ground for something much bigger." Korath's expression darkened as he studied the fleet composition. "Subjugation fleet," he growled. "Those ships are configured for planetary bombardment and occupation." One of the Centaurians pointed to a distant star cluster. "The Vega colonies. There are 12 worlds there, mostly agricultural. Billions of civilians." The pieces fell into place in Sarah's mind. They're using Omega 7 to break resistance leaders, extract information about defensive capabilities, planetary layouts, key infrastructure. This isn't just a prison. It's the preparation center for genocide. The weight of that realization spurred them forward with renewed urgency. They weren't just escaping for their own survival anymore. They were potentially the only ones who could warn the Vega colonies about what was coming. Level 7's maintenance bay was exactly as the Centaurians had described, a cramped facility filled with small utility vessels. Sarah quickly identified the most promising option, a medical transport designed for long-range evacuation missions. "This one," she said, running her hands over the sleek hull. "Full medical facilities, long-range communications, and fast enough to outrun most patrol ships." Korath examined the vessel with a critical eye. "It appears sound. But how do we navigate past the fleet?" Sarah was already climbing into the pilot's seat, her fingers dancing over controls she'd learned during her residency on the frontier worlds. "Medical transports have special clearance codes. If we can transmit an emergency beacon claiming to be evacuating critically injured Federation personnel." "Deception," Korath mused. "Not typically the draconic way, but perhaps necessary." As Sarah powered up the ship's systems, alarms throughout the bay began shrieking. Enforcement mechs smashed through the sealed blast doors, their weapons already charging. "Time to go," Sarah shouted, initiating the launch sequence. The transport lifted off just as the first energy bolts seared through the air where they'd been standing. Korath pressed himself against the ship's rear bulkhead, too large to fit comfortably in the human-sized vessel, but managing nonetheless. Sarah's hands flew over the controls as she piloted them through the bay's exit tunnel. Behind them, Enforcer pursuit craft were already launching, their sleek forms designed for exactly this kind of chase. "Broadcasting medical emergency codes," Sarah announced as they emerged into open space. "Maybe we can bluff our way past the outer perimeter." For a moment, it seemed to work. The pursuit craft fell back as Sarah's medical beacon claimed priority clearance for a critical casualty evacuation. They were halfway to the fleet's outer edge when a voice crackled over the communication system. "Medical Transport 77 Alpha. This is Fleet Commander Vex. You will halt immediately and submit to inspection. Sarah's blood ran cold. Fleet Commander Vex was a legend throughout Federation space. A genetically enhanced human who had orchestrated the subjugation of 17 worlds. If he was personally involved in their pursuit, their deception wasn't going to hold. "We're carrying Federation casualties with critical injuries," Sarah transmitted back, trying to keep her voice steady. "Every second counts if we're going to save them." "Interesting." Vex's voice was coldly amused. "According to our records, the only Federation casualties at Omega 7 today were inflicted by an escaped prisoner. Care to explain how you acquire these casualties?" Their cover was blown. Sarah slammed the thruster controls forward, sending their stolen transport racing toward the edge of Federation space at maximum acceleration. "You cannot outrun the entire fleet," Korath observed calmly. "No," Sarah agreed, checking their navigation systems. "But I'll need to outrun the whole fleet. Just long enough to get a message out." She began recording on all frequencies, transmitting everything they had learned about Omega 7, the planned assault on the Vega colonies, and the brutal truth about the Federation's treatment of prisoners. "This is Dr. Sarah Chun, Federation Medical License 7749 Alpha," she spoke into the transmitter. "I am broadcasting proof of war crimes being committed at Detention Station Omega 7. The Federation is planning the systematic destruction of 12 civilian worlds in the Vega system. The evidence I'm transmitting contains fleet positions, battle plans, and documented proof of the torture and murder of prisoners of war." Behind them, the pursuit fleet was gaining rapidly. Energy bolts began to flash past their hull as the faster ships came into weapons range. "They will destroy us before the message reaches its destination," Korath warned. Sarah smiled grimly, her fingers working over the ship's systems. "Medical transports are equipped with quantum entanglement communicators for emergency situations." The message was transmitted instantaneously to every medical station in this sector the moment I started recording. Korath's eyes widened with what might have been admiration. "You have learned deception quickly, human." "I had a good teacher in patience and planning," Sarah replied. A massive energy blast rocked their ship, sending them spinning through space. Through the spinning viewport, Sarah could see the pursuing dreadnought powering up its main guns for a killing shot. But before it could fire, something extraordinary happened. Ships began dropping out of hyperspace around them. Not Federation vessels, but a ragtag fleet of freighters, mining barges, and converted passenger liners. The Vega Colonial Defense Force had received Sarah's message and responded faster than anyone thought possible. "Medical Transport 77 Alpha. This is Captain Martinez of the colonial ship Free Horizon." A warm voice crackled over their communications. "We've come to collect our heroes." As the colonial ships engaged the Federation fleet in a desperate, delaying action, Sarah piloted their damaged transport toward the safety of friendly lines. Beside her, Korath watched the battle through the viewports, his ancient eyes reflecting both sorrow and hope. "Your people fight bravely," he observed. "They're not just my people anymore," Sarah replied, glancing at her unlikely companion. "After today, anyone who stands against tyranny is my people." As they docked with the Free Horizon, Sarah knew their escape was only the beginning. The Federation would not forgive what they had done, and the war for the Vega colonies would be brutal. But they had given the innocent a chance to defend themselves, and they had proven that even the galaxy's most powerful force could be challenged by those brave enough to stand together. Korath, the last dragon of Altair Prime, had found a new purpose among the stars. And Sarah, a simple medic who had only wanted to heal, had become something she never expected. A symbol of resistance that would inspire others to stand against darkness. The Galactic Federation had made a fatal error when they put a healer and a dragon in the same cell. They had hoped to break them both, but instead had forged an alliance that would challenge their dominion over the galaxy itself.